Back in 1983, when Return of the Jedi released in theaters, nerds across the world screamed in pain and disappointment when they saw their favorite bounty hunter fall into the sarlacc pit and die. According to Jabba the Hutt, he would be devoured and suffer for 1,000 years. Over the decades, Boba Fett's backstory was explored and he was given more depth, but everyone still knew his inevitable death. In the old expanded universe, Boba Fett actually climbed out of the sarlacc pit and survived. So once the canon was rebooted, fans speculated if Boba Fett would still crawl out of the sarlacc pit and survive in the new canon. Flash forward to October 30th, 2021, in the premiere episode of The Mandalorian Season 2, we got our first look at Boba Fett alive and well after Return of the Jedi. And then 7 weeks later, we were teased to the Book of Boba Fett, the show that would center around the bounty hunter. So not only after all these decades did we learn Boba Fett had lived, but he was also getting his own story that so many people had wished for. The Book of Boba Fett was the second show to come out in the mandoverse. When this show finally wrapped up, how did fans view it? Was it the show of their dreams? Did it match the quality of the previous 2 Mandalorian seasons? Was Boba Fett the badass we all thought him to be? Were Boba Fett fans happy to finally see him get his own show? Hello everybody and welcome to another video. My name is the Goldman and today we're gonna talk about the Book of Boba Fett. To begin this video essay, I want to discuss the world building, an aspect of Star Wars I feel isn't discussed enough anymore these days. To no one's surprise, there are 2 different sides to the world building in this series. Firstly, there is the main part of the series that takes place on Tatooine, and then there's the world building that focuses mostly on Mando and his journey. So let's begin with Tatooine. The world building here is interesting because Tatooine is already the most prominently shown planet in the Star Wars saga. By the way, I'm just talking about the live action stuff here. You guys know how much I love the Clone Wars and Rebels, but a good portion of the people who are watching this series haven't watched the animated shows, only the movies and The Mandalorian. So how well does the show build on the world that is Tatooine? Before we answer that, what did we already know about Tatooine going into this series? Based on the movies, there were 3 different sides of Tatooine that we saw. There's Mos Eisley and the kinda wilderness of Tatooine we saw in A New Hope. Then there's the criminal aspect of Tatooine that we saw in Return of the Jedi, and then there's Mos Espa that we saw in The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. Tatooine was known for mostly having a variety of different species, none that were really native to the planet though. The ones that were mostly native to Tatooine are the Jawas and the Tusken Raiders. The Jawas get a little bit more fleshing out in The Mandalorian Season 1, but not much. Now the Tusken Raiders, on the other hand, that is where this series excels. From the movies, the Tusken Raiders were literally seen as savages. A New Hope treats them as such, and Attack of the Clone treats them even worse because they are responsible for brutally murdering Shmi Skywalker. And Anakin ended up committing genocide against them, which doesn't help things either. The Mandalorian took small steps to humanize the Tuskens. In Chapter 5, we see them have one conversation where they communicate with some form of sign language, and Chapter 9 did basically the same thing, but on a much larger scale. Now, the Book of Boba Fett took all of that and made the Tusken Raiders an actual fleshed out culture. The first thing that the series does wonderfully is show the diversity within the community. Before, all the Tusken Raiders looked exactly the same. They didn't have different designs to them, but here we see plenty of different designs for the Tuskens. From a narrative perspective, this is done to help us differentiate between the Tuskens, but from a world building perspective, it adds layers to the culture. We see women and children who are distinctly different from the usual males we see. Not everyone of any culture is the same. That's why it's so important we see diversity within said culture, like how the Mandalorians all have different armor. Besides simply looking different, there's an established way of life that is explored. They drink water out of these ball type things. I really have no other way to describe them. They also have these little worm things that provide some food. The gaffy stick was another great addition to the Tusken culture. Fighting styles are vastly unique depending on the culture. Even if you look at modern day weapons, just on the design you can tell what cultures certain firearms belong to. The gaffy stick is representative of the Tusken Tusken Raiders style of fighting, a style we haven't really seen in Star Wars before. The reluctance to ride the speeder bikes also subtly says a lot about their culture. The Tuskens are a very primitive species. They aren't familiar with the technologies that most people in the Star Wars galaxy are familiar with. Boba training them to ride the bikes was an effective way of separating the Tuskens from other cultures we have seen in a humane way. This series also fixed a major problem I had with Chapter 9 of The Mandalorian that no one seemed to ever address. If you watch the final battle against the Great Dragon and the other times the dragon is encountered, it's only the Tuskens who are killed. No joke, when the people of Mos Pelgo and the Tuskens team up to fight the Great Dragon, only Tusken Raiders die, not a single human being. What this subconsciously tells the audience is that they are lesser than human beings because the storytellers think killing human beings would be too dark, but not the Tusken Raiders. A lot of Tusken Raiders die in this series, way more than in Chapter 9 of The Mandalorian, but each time they do, there's an emotional weight that hadn't existed in The Mandalorian or especially the movies. I can't tell you how happy I was to see the Tusken Raiders actually be treated seriously for once. The last detail that probably fleshed out the Tusken Raiders was the lizard ritual in Chapter 2. Nothing separates a culture more than a ritual of initiation. Boba Fett must take this lizard up the nose and then experience a really bad trip to get a branch from a sacred tree to make his own gaffy stick. This is the Tusken Raiders' way of the Jedi getting their own kyber crystal and forming their lightsaber. As trippy and odd as this scene was, it was a fantastic way of expanding the culture of the Tusken Raiders. The world building done with the Tusken Raiders was phenomenal. Never had I thought the Tuskens would get this much development, and Favreau and Filoni and Rodriguez did a fantastic job here. But the Tusken Raiders are only one part of Tatooine. What else did we learn? Let's talk about Mos Espa. One aspect of the cinematography I loved in this series was the scale of Mos Espa. Beforehand in The Phantom Menace, we never really got an idea of the geography of the city. It was always just a bunch of buildings that we saw our characters travel to and from, but here we get these wide shots that show us what the town is really like. There's this outer ring area, and then there's this town square that's in this crater. You know, one of the main reasons why the Battle of Helm's Deep is such a great battle? It's because everyone in the audience understands the geography of the castle. When the battle moves from character to character, we know where they are because the movie did the legwork to lay the foundation of the geography of Helm's Deep. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say that Mos Espa is as well designed as Helm's Deep, but the city does a good job. Outside of the geography, we get an idea of the economy of the city as well. Just like we've seen plenty of times, there are plenty of people with little shops all around town. We also see how there are a bunch of different clubs that people can go to for entertainment. There are a variety of different activities and entertainers in these clubs, and hey, good for the ladies. This may be the first time we've seen a male Twi'lek sexualized on Tatooine. Another neat detail I loved was the civilian cruisers that land on the outskirts of the city. Seeing people go on these transports to travel from one planet to another was actually a great way to ground this city. Seeing Mando have to travel through security with his weapons was also a great detail. I loved seeing the different leaders that showed up to Boba Fett's meeting. Earlier, it was explained how different races controlled one of the three parts of town. I believe one race was the Trandoshans and another was the Niktos. This was a great detail that is totally realistic for a town like Mos Espa. Probably the most controversial aspect of the world building of Tatooine here would be the Vespas. The Vespas are actually pretty three-dimensional. We see they have all these weird appendages that make them fairly unique compared to other kids we've seen in Star Wars. They ride these unique speeder bikes that definitely stand out. They are also dressed rather differently than anything we have seen on Tatooine. Now, just because the designs of these people are unique, that doesn't mean it always works. It is tough to pinpoint specifically why the Vespas feel off, but if I had to make an educated guess, it would probably be the contrast between their design and Tatooine. These people are basically cyborgs who have fancy scooters, but they are also the same people who are poor enough to where they need to steal water. See how that doesn't really make sense? Now, Goldman, these kids are teenagers. They could have easily stolen the bikes. Now, that's true and a good point, but even if that were the case, it still clashes with the tone of Tatooine. I will say this though, I 100% of the time rather Star Wars creators experiment with new ideas like the Vespas than repeat the same styles we've seen over and over again. So even though I wasn't a big fan of their design, the series does still get points here from me for trying something new. Something that gets no points from me, however, are the Pikes. I'm astonished how the series can do such a great job of fleshing out the Tusken Raiders and Mos Espa, but do such an awful job fleshing out the Pikes. The Pikes are arguably more important than the previous two, because the series series revolves around the war between Boba Fett and this faction. Now tell me, in 7 chapters of the Book of Boba Fett, what do we know about the Pikes? We know they like spice and they are involved in trading it, and that they are petty because they killed the Tuskens. What else about this syndicate do we know? We don't know what their philosophy is, no rituals or nuggets about their culture. Remember how I praised the Tuskens for having diverse appearances? Well, there is none of that here with the Pikes. They all look exactly the same except for the leader. Do we know why they are so invested in the spice? Is it for religious reasons, or are they simply greedy people who like drugs? You know how I gave the criticism of chapter 9 of The Mandalorian that they treated the Tuskens like they were lesser than humans because they were the ones to always die? The same could be said about the Pikes here. In the final battle, a few no-named humans die, but that is simply a fraction of how many Pikes die. The Pikes are picked off one by one, and never is it treated with an ounce of seriousness, besides the leader, I guess. In short, we know absolutely nothing about this syndicate, and it derails a good portion of the series. If it weren't for the Pikes, the world building of Tatooine would be pretty close to flawless. But considering the Pikes are the main antagonistic force of this series, it is a big shame. But we aren't done yet. We still need to address the world building in the Mandalorian episodes. So here we get a look into the Mandalorian culture in this ring world, as well as a look into Luke's Jedi Academy. Somehow in a show about Boba Fett, the Mandalorian culture is delved upon quite deeply. We finally get answers to what the Night of 1,000 Tears was. We kinda all assumed that something happened on Mandalore, but seeing the force the Empire sent to attempt to exterminate Mandalorians was brutal. So not only does it expand on the Mandalorians, but also the Empire. We get a fair amount of exposition from the Armorer too about how these Mandalorians differ from other Mandalorians we have seen. The first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian already established how Mando's faction and Bo-Katan's faction differ from each other, but seeing the Armorer's views on Bo-Katan was a great way to expand their culture. We all know that certain cultures have many subcultures and denominations, but seeing these subcultures' views on each other in some ways is just as important, and we get a fair amount of that here. Moving on to Luke's Academy, considering it just consisted of Luke, Ahsoka, and Grogu, there's only so much we can learn. We do get a good look into Luke's philosophy and how he will run his Jedi Academy. That's more of an aspect of his character than it is world building, so I'll touch on that in a later part. Those are pretty much all the aspects of the world building in the series. Easily the most effective part of the world building is the Tusken Raiders. The work that the storytellers did fleshing out these people that were previously seen as savages was phenomenal. The city of Mos Espa was also fleshed out nicely. The scope of that city was expanded far greater than what we saw in The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and the little details that we got of the Mandalorian and Luke's cultures were also fairly good. As I stated earlier, the Pike Syndicate and their lack of development really derails the world building of this series. I cannot fathom why Favreau thought it would be a good idea to give the Pikes this little attention in the series. Overall, the world building in the series is pretty top notch, and the only bit of world building that left more to be desired was the Pike Syndicate. Hey guys, before I continue on with this video, only 4.9% of my viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Usually I will devote different sections of the video to each of the main characters and then have one section for all the supporting characters. But as you will notice in a second, there's a pretty good reason why even Boba Fett himself doesn't get his own section. I have a lot to say about the characters in this series. If you look at every movie or show in the Star Wars canon, they kinda have their own main crew, if you will. Usually there's a main character, and then there are 4 or 5 supporting characters. With the originals, Luke was the main character, and then supporting him were Han, Leia, Chewbacca, 3PO, R2, and Lando. With the prequels, you had Anakin as the main character, and then next to him were Obi-Wan, Padme, Qui-Gon, R2, and loosely supporting him were Yoda and Mace Windu. In the sequels, you have Rey as the main character, and supporting her, you have Finn, Poe, BB-8, Rose, Chewbacca, and 3PO. The Mandalorian strayed a little bit away from this, but it's a formula that still worked. Now, I want you to tell me who consists of Boba Fett's crew. You got Fennec Fennec and Mando for sure. Then there's Chrysantan, Drash, and Scad. In literally every story I mentioned, the main character has a strong relationship with most of the supporting cast. Those stories also spend time developing those supporting characters thoroughly. Besides Fennec and Mando, who else in the show does Boba Fett have a strong relationship with? And if you really think about it, the relationship between Mando and Boba is a bit weird. Boba in season 2 came to get his armor back, and once he got it, he stuck around for a few more episodes and then left. And now Mando is willing to risk his life to help his cause? It's odd. Before I began writing this section, I looked up all the character posters for the Book of Boba Fett, so I can at least have an idea about who to write about. And you know what I've realized? The only characters in this series who have an ounce of depth are the ones that were in The Mandalorian. If we take out the characters that appeared in that series and only look at the characters that were introduced in this show, none of them get any development. The Hutts, I think, are in 2 scenes. This mechanic guy is only in 2 scenes. This older guy is in 2 or 3 scenes. Danny Trejo was in 2 scenes. While the Tusken Raiders were really awesome, none of them individually got much development. So that leaves us with Garsa Fwip, Major Domo, Chrysantan, the Vespas, and Cad Bane. Garsa Fwip, whose name I needed to look up, had what? A few scenes with Boba Fett? And what's her personality? She's charming, sure. I liked that one scene where she tried to stop Chrysantan from killing the Trandoshan, but besides that, there's no other scene where we even get a remote hint at her personality. Wasted character. Next, let's look at Chrysantan. Conceptually, he's a rather cool character, who was introduced in the comics, by the way, but what's his personality? He's angry a lot, he's a good fighter, that's all I can think of. So Chrysantan was also wasted. What about the Vespas? You get to learn a decent amount about Drash. She's a hot-headed teen, likes to make passionate statements a lot, she's proud of her origins and wants to defend the city. That's all I can think of? You know what's pretty crazy? I can make a good argument that Major Domo is the most 3-dimensional character of these first 4 episodes outside of Boba Fett. No joke, I can tell you more about him than I could tell you about Fennec. And to be honest, Fennec doesn't really get any development here either. In the first episode of the flashback with Fennec, we kinda learn about why she decides to join Boba Fett. She's fed up with bounty hunting in a way just like Boba is. But besides those scenes in the flashback, is there a single moment in the present where we learn something about her personally? I don't think so. In fact, in the present part of the storyline, there isn't a single time where Fennec and Boba Fett have a conversation about something that doesn't have to do with the Pikes or running their own syndicate. You know what's criminally underrated in Star Wars? Where nothing is going on other than 2 or 3 characters expressing their thoughts to each other. You know that scene where Anakin says bye to Obi-Wan before he leaves for Utapau? That's a great scene. Or that scene between Rey and Maz Kanata where Maz tells Rey the belonging she seeks is not behind her, it is ahead. These are great scenes that allow us to learn more about the characters and their goals and motivations. Boba Fett does not manage to have this conversation with the supposed second most important character in the show. Yes, we often see the 2 of them talk on the top of a balcony, but they shouldn't be always talking about the plot. The scenes I mentioned before were just characters getting things off their chest and opening up to each other. So I'm sorry if this is a hot take, but I don't think Fennec Shand is a good supporting character. Her and the new characters in the series are all either underdeveloped or are piss poor characters. The Mandalorian season 2 introduced a bunch of great characters and further developed the existing supporting characters. Now you may say Goldman, Bo-Katan, and Ahsoka don't count. They were in the Clone Wars and Rebels, but they do count because anyone who hasn't watched the animated shows and only The Mandalorian can still tell you a lot about those characters. The Book of Boba Fett doesn't have a single new character that is even remotely as fleshed out as the new characters in The Mandalorian outside of maybe Major Domo. This is bad character development and there's no way around it. But even worse than all of that are the villains. There are really 3 villains in the show: the head of the Pikes, the mayor, and Cad Bane. As you probably guessed, the mayor and the head of the Pikes are awful villains. We know nothing about their personalities, their motivations, or their ideals. Villains cannot get any worse than this. I understand not really fleshing out the head of the Pikes, but the mayor had a great opportunity to be developed. The story could answer questions like why he wanted to be involved with the Pikes. Did he feel the Pikes could just offer him safety? Did he simply just want money? I can't answer any of these questions, so what am I supposed to think about him? Then there's Cad Bane. His introduction in chapter 6 was effective. We saw in the beginning of the episode how good of a shot Cobb Vanth is, so seeing Cad Bane contrast that at the end of the episode was great. But in the finale, they didn't do anything with him. He taunts Boba for a bit, then they fight and Boba wins. There's no way anyone out there doesn't feel like Cad Bane's death was anticlimactic. We get a few hints that Boba and Bane have a past together, but anyone who hasn't seen the Clone Wars Wars won't understand any of it. I don't understand why they simply didn't establish Cad Bane as the main villain at the beginning of the story. This way, what happens at the end has a much more effective payoff. Overall, the villains are probably the most disappointing aspect of the characters. Now let's look at the characters that were from The Mandalorian that appeared in the series. The Armorer is great. We learn more about her thoughts on other Mandalorian cultures and the significance of the Night of 1,000 Tears. So with the limited time she was in the series, we learned a decent amount about her. What about Peli Motto? I wouldn't say we learned more about her. She's kind of just there to be comedic relief and help Mando get the Naboo starfighter. What about Cobb Vanth? I love me some Cobb Vanth. Again, we don't really learn much else about him. He's still the same guy who he was in Mando Season 2. What about Ahsoka? She didn't really have any reason to be in this series. She tells Mando about the dangers of going to see Grogu, and then she has a conversation with Luke and leaves. I honestly have no clue why she was in this series other than so fans can get a moment where she chats with Luke. I'm not saying what the series did with these characters was bad, but the series just doesn't really do anything with them. With all the negativity aside, let's talk about the characters that actually do get development here. We may not learn a lot about Mando here, but the way he expresses his emotions in the series is just as powerful as in his own series. The crux of his 2 episodes is that he greatly misses Grogu. I found the scene on the civilian transport to be fairly powerful, akin to the scene in Chapter 3 where he decides to go back and save Grogu. Now, is the shape of the wrapping similar to Grogu way too on the nose? I would say so, but I'm a sucker for silent storytelling, so moments like these I'm almost always gonna enjoy. Let's talk about Luke and Grogu. Even as someone who loves The Last Jedi, it was nice to see a younger, more optimistic Luke again. I always get annoyed when in The Mandalorian Season 2 people would say that version of Luke was in character. We don't see Luke's personality or beliefs shine through there. He just tells Mando that Grogu needs to be trained if he wants to be safe, and then he leaves. But here, we actually get to see a bit of what kind of teacher he will be. Seeing him make comments like, always get back up, was awesome to see. But of course, we can't talk about Luke and not address his controversial ultimatum. Luke basically tells Grogu that he must choose between his attachment to Mando or a path with the Jedi. Many fans saw this moment as Luke being hypocritical. It was his attachments to his friends and family that made him such a great Jedi. And attachments especially mattered in Return of the Jedi when his love for his father was what saved him from the dark side. But here he wants Grogu to forego his attachments to become a Jedi. Is this hypocritical, and is Luke reverting back to the old way of the Jedi? Absolutely not. There's a difference between having attachment and being forced to be away from someone else. Think about it. Was Grogu in The Mandalorian Season 2 ever given a choice about what his future should be? Mando was told by the Armorer that Grogu needed to be with his own kind, and then Luke just took him away. Grogu never expressed what he actually wanted. Luke could tell that Grogu missed Mando greatly, and that his heart wasn't really into being a Jedi. Luke made the mature decision and basically asked Grogu if this is what he wanted. Do you really want to be a Jedi, or would you rather be a Mandalorian? There's a world out there where Grogu can be a Jedi and have an attachment to Mando, and Luke would embrace it, but that isn't what happens here. In short, Grogu doesn't want to be a Jedi. Luke giving Grogu this decision already shows an advancement in the philosophy of the Jedi from the ones we saw in the prequels. The prequel era Jedi would have never let Grogu make this decision in the first place. So that's my take on Luke. They did a pretty good job fleshing out this version of the character and what kind of Jedi he will be. With every other character out of the way, let's finally talk about Boba Fett himself. Even if all the supporting characters were awful, if the main character is fantastic, it can salvage the story. Does Boba Fett do that? The characterization of Boba Fett in this series is complicated, because Boba Fett is a pre-existing character. There are certain expectations that this show needs to meet. Now, right off the bat, the show establishes that this is a completely different Boba Fett. There's a reason why in Battlefront 2, Boba Fett is listed as a villain. He's a bounty hunter, one that was supposedly ruthless. There's a reason why Vader said to him no disintegrations, because Boba is that lethal. Now, there's nothing wrong with having different versions of the character. So considering the flashbacks begin right where the character left off in Return of the Jedi, there's an expectation that the show will do the legwork to explain this character change, but the show simply doesn't do it. He begins the flashbacks as the kind person we see him to be in the rest of the series. He wants to help the Tusken Raiders, and he goes through all this trouble to make sure they're safe and well protected. And this happens without a gradual change from the Boba in the movies. An argument I've heard in response to this was that Boba had a life-altering event happen to him, and that is falling into the Sarlacc pit. Life-altering events can make a person change rather quickly, this is true, but after Boba crawls out of the Sarlacc pit, there isn't a moment where he expresses any form of trauma. He doesn't ever reflect on the Sarlacc as a moment that he felt greatly affected him, and nothing in the story hints towards that. In the first Iron Man movie, also written by Jon Favreau, the story makes it a point that getting captured by those terrorists and almost dying by his own weapons was a moment that changed Tony Stark. He straight up says it a few times, and his actions back it up. There's nothing like that with Boba Fett here, so you can't use the traumatic experience excuse because the evidence just doesn't back it up. So all in all, the transition between the old and new Boba Fett isn't executed well. Now, when I began talking about Boba Fett, I said his characterization was complicated, because while I don't think they did a good job with his transformation from the movies, if we just look at this as an isolated story, this version of Boba Fett is definitely three-dimensional and well-developed. He's simply a kind and empathetic man, and his actions throughout all the flashbacks show this. The fact that he would go back and help the Tusken Raiders after they basically kidnapped him and treated him like crap says a lot about his character. When he shows up to the bar, he kicks the biker gang's asses because he doesn't like bullies. When talking to Fennec about his motivations, it's clear how much the Tuskens meant to him and how he doesn't want that to happen to anyone else again. Now, to be honest, I don't think they did a great job establishing his motivations, but it's still done a little bit here. We see what kind of leader he is. He takes valuable input from his peers and respects their decisions, even if sometimes those decisions don't make any sense. If I had to use one word to describe the characterization of Boba Fett in this series alone, I would say it is satisfactory. They do some legwork in fleshing out this character, mostly in the flashbacks, but there is still so much more they could have done. The characters in this series are complicated. I think they did a good job with a few important characters, but a rather poor job with a lot of them. The development of the characters should be the most important aspect of any story, and this is why it baffles me that most of the main characters in the series are done so poorly. Up next, I want to discuss the overall story of the Book of Boba Fett. Usually when I discuss the characters, I will see how they actively affect the story, but that section was more so focused on how three-dimensional they were. In this section, I want to focus on the story of the Book of Boba Fett and what message it is potentially trying to say. And this is where things get tough. The Book of Boba Fett is split into three different parts, if you will. The first part is the first 4 chapters, which is pretty much all about Boba Fett and what's going on Tatooine. The second part is chapters 5 and 6, which is all about Mando and what he's up to, and then part 3 is chapter 7, and that wraps up both parts 1 and 2. This topic has been addressed to death, but because this is an in-depth review of the series, I still need to address it too. The shift in the series from Boba's story to Mando's story is jarring. It would be one thing if Boba Fett played an active role in these 2 Mando-focused episodes, but besides one scene where he stands there and says nothing, he plays virtually no role. So the question that is often discussed is, are you allowed to say these 2 episodes are good episodes of the Book of Boba Fett or good episodes of The Mandalorian Season 2.5? Before we answer this question, we need to look at the story up to this point. So what is the story in the first 4 chapters? Well, there's really 2 plots going on. There's the current plot, which is Boba Fett trying to build his empire, and then the other is his flashbacks, and how those flashbacks got him to the point where he was at in The Mandalorian Season 2. I feel implementing these 2 stories concurrently was a poor decision. To begin the series, we have no clue why Boba wants to rule his own empire. One could initially assume it's that he just wants power, but as the series progresses, that is clearly not the case. The reason why this was such a poor decision was because it halts the pacing at times. The show does a decent job in the beginning of piquing our interest with the Hutts and the people challenging Boba's rule, but then it flashes back to his time with the Tusken Raiders, which is a completely different story. But regardless of the order in which these 2 stories are told, there's a glaring problem, and that is that Boba Fett doesn't have any kind of arc in this series. In The Mandalorian Season 1, I talked about how Mando had 2 arcs. The first arc was about him finding a cause to fight for, to find a purpose with his life, if you will, and he found that with Grogu. The rest of the series, he goes on what I call a flat arc. This is an arc where the character doesn't change, but his or her values and morals are tested, and usually they inspire the characters around them to change. From the second Boba Fett crawls out of the sarlacc pit to the end of chapter 7, Boba Fett simply does not change at all. Some Some have said that this series was about him becoming a good leader and fighting for a good cause, but if that is the case, Boba Fett never once struggles with this change. If you look at the best character arcs, the characters usually have something they want, but in order to get what they want, they need to change something about themselves. The want is external and usually is about the plot. The need is internal, where the character must make a realization about themselves and change. Throughout the original trilogy, Luke wants to become a Jedi, but he struggles with this because he doesn't often trust in himself or in the Force. This is why he struggles so much in The Empire Strikes Back. So his need is that he must always trust in himself and what he feels is right. And by Return of the Jedi, he doesn't strike down Vader because he trusts his feelings that Vader can be returned to the light. And because of that, he was right, and he became a full-on Jedi Knight. Anakin in the prequels has a negative character arc, which is completely different, so I won't touch on it here. Rey begins her own trilogy wanting belonging. She is waiting for her parents to return to her because to her, that's the only belonging that matters. What she needs to realize throughout the trilogy is that the belonging doesn't necessarily mean those you share your blood with. Anyone can be your family. By the end of The Rise of Skywalker, she learns this realization and changes because of it. In the Book of Boba Fett, Boba wants to bring peace to Tatooine by being a fair ruler, but there is nothing he needs to learn about himself that is preventing him from achieving his goals. There is no flaw that Boba Fett has to overcome. But Goldman, maybe he's going through a flat arc because he doesn't change. If that's the case, then what morals or values of his are tested throughout the series? There aren't any. Boba Fett simply doesn't have any arc in this series. Every decision he makes is one that is completely external. This entire series is 100% plot related when it comes to Boba Fett. If there is no character flaw or moral that Boba Fett struggles with, then there is no story. What is the message that the series of the Book of Boba Fett is trying to say? The original sent a message about trusting in yourself and trusting in the power of unconditional love. The prequel sent a message about the dangers of possessive love and how it can corrupt you. Also, there's some political messages in there. The sequels are about how family is more than just those you share genetics with. The Mandalorian is about the importance of family and how it can change a person for the better. What is the message of the Book of Boba Fett? To the best of my knowledge, there is no story. There's just plot. Is the story about the importance of fighting for those who cannot defend themselves, like the Tuskens or the people of Mos Espa? If this is the story, then Boba Fett has no arc that ties into this story. Thus, there isn't really a message conveyed by the storytellers. Now, the plot is important for sure, but the story is way more important. Now, let's talk about the two chapters that are Mando focused. Are you allowed to say that these are good episodes of the Book of Boba Fett? I would say no, because these two episodes have nothing to do with the plot or the borderline non-existent story of the Book of Boba Fett. They're good episodes, but if you remove Mando from the story, then nothing changes. And this brings me to my major problems of the series. Mando, Grogu, and Luke should have never been in this series in the first place. The story about Mando missing Grogu does nothing to better serve the character of Boba Fett. If anything, it distracts from it because the audience is way more invested in Mando and Grogu than they are with Boba Fett. But easily the worst aspect of the inclusion of Mando was that it undermined the story of The Mandalorian Season 2 hard. Think about what happens here from Mando's point of view. He goes to see Grogu just because he misses him. He's not asking to take Grogu away from Luke, he just wants to see him. He leaves after giving Ahsoka a gift, which is armor for Grogu. He helps fight with Boba Fett, and then out of the blue, Grogu shows up and Mando is happy. If this were realistic, Mando would be asking himself what the hell happened with Luke and why is Grogu here? Mando doesn't know that Grogu made a choice to abandon the path of the Jedi for him. He doesn't know that Grogu never wanted to be a Jedi in the first place. He doesn't know anything about the decision Grogu made, other than that Grogu is now here and present. Throughout Season 2, Mando is tasked with bringing Grogu to the Jedi. He accomplished that goal after abandoning his Mandalorian code twice to do so. Now, only a few episodes later, not only are they reunited, but Mando doesn't learn anything about Grogu or himself because of it. Had Luke showed up with Grogu and told Mando that Grogu chose to leave the Jedi to be with him, then Mando would at least know that he did a good job. He cared for this child and he knows that he can be a good father. Mando repeated a certain line very often, and that line was that he took Grogu to his own kind. I thought for sure this would be set up for a moment where Mando realizes that Grogu is his kind. This can be a powerful moment for the two of them, but nope, that was tossed aside and Grogu just shows up. We all know that a reunion between Mando and Grogu was inevitable, but I cannot fathom why, from a narrative perspective, Favreau thought that reuniting them this quickly was a good decision, especially in a series not called The Mandalorian. Think about this. If someone watched watches The Mandalorian, they get the emotional goodbye in season 2, and then season 3 begins and they are already together. This doesn't sit right with me at all. How is a casual viewer supposed to know that they need to watch a show called The Book of Boba Fett between The Mandalorian seasons 2 and 3? Is The Mandalorian season 3 going to begin with a caption that says, please watch The Book of Boba Fett if you haven't watched it already? This doesn't sit right with me at all. I am very disappointed with Favreau that he didn't trust that The Mandalorian could survive a few episodes without Grogu. Mando and Grogu reuniting not only has nothing to do with Boba Fett and his story, but it undermines the story of The Mandalorian. So while these 2 episodes are very entertaining and well written, in the context of the series that it takes place in and how soon after The Mandalorian season 2 it happens, these episodes do a serious amount of damage. With all that aside, the finale could have saved the season. From a narrative perspective, the finale was a complete mess. Boba Fett makes so many decisions in this chapter that make no sense, and nothing has any stakes here either. Firstly, Boba Fett agrees with Drash to fortify in the blown up cantina because they supposedly need to show the people of Mos Espa that they are here to protect them. But this makes no sense because the Pikes aren't there to attack civilians. They are there to attack Boba. Fortifying the base at Jabba's palace is a better decision. And if anything, staying in Mos Espa puts the civilians in danger. As the episode progresses, we start to realize that the Pikes are one of the most pathetic factions in Star Wars. They are supposedly going to war against Boba Fett. The Pikes have what should be 100 or so soldiers, Cad Bane, and 2 spider droids that are very powerful. Boba Fett has himself, Fennec, Mando, Chrysantan, and the Mos Espa Vespas, which consist of like 10 people. And by the end of the episode, not a single character that is named on Boba Fett's side of the war dies. Those 2 droids that we saw that took half an episode to destroy killed maybe 1 or 2 no-named characters. At least we saw the First Order kill a bunch of random X-Wing pilots. Also, why is stopping the spice trade so important to Boba? It's not like the Pikes are out here actively trying to kill him. They are only attacking Boba because Boba wants to stop them. You could argue that drug trading is always bad news, and this is true, but not once are we shown the negative effects that the spice trade has on the people of Tatooine. We should have seen how the Pikes' presence on Tatooine is hurting innocent people, but based solely on what is presented, Boba Fett is fighting a useless war. The only reason the Pikes attacked him a while back was because he attacked them first. But you know what for me was the worst narrative choice? It was bringing the Rancor into battle. Was this cool to see? Sure, but when you think about it, this decision emphasizes how dumb Boba Fett is. You do realize that at some point Boba Fett went through this thought process. He went back to his castle, he walked past Slave 1 and said, nah, I'm better off bringing a Rancor all the way to Mos Espa instead. Just flying over in Slave 1 would have been a far better decision. This way you don't have to worry about a Rancor wrecking havoc on the city. I guess you could argue that the Slave 1's weapons couldn't destroy the shields of the spider droids, but the weapons on Slave 1 are powerful, and I don't believe that they couldn't break through the shields of the spider droids. To me, this just summarized that this series was all about showing off cool things in the sandbox of Tatooine that really don't make any sense. The cherry on top of all of this is that in Boba Fett's last scene, he realizes that he doesn't really want to be a leader on Tatooine anymore. The implication here is that he will probably join Mando in season 3 and whatever missions Mando goes on. I want you to tell me this: if this series never existed and The Mandalorian season 3 immediately followed season 2, would anything change? Boba Fett didn't change at all, and since he is no longer in charge of the Syndicate on Tatooine, he has no army or anything he can call upon to help Mando if he needs it. Going forward, the only reason someone needs to watch this series is because Mando and Grogu are reunited. Think about this. The only reason to watch a show called The Book of Boba Fett has nothing to do with Boba Fett. Overall, man, I'm disappointed. I loved, and I mean loved, The Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2. I am baffled that this series decided to take the story of the Mandoverse in this direction. So, The Book of Boba Fett. How will this series be remembered? I feel most people just have apathy towards this series. This series didn't ruin the legacy of Star Wars or derail the Skywalker saga like some people have complained about with other shows, but it didn't really do anything special either. While there are people who loved this series, you aren't going to find anyone who really passionately loves it. Are you going to find a whole segment of the fandom who will go out of their way to defend this show? No way. If we compare this to the sequels real quick, yeah, the hatred towards the sequels is far far stronger than any hatred towards the Book of Boba Fett, but there does exist a good portion of people who do love the sequels and will go out of their way to defend it. These strong emotions, both positive and negative, I feel are better to have than the apathy towards the Book of Boba Fett. No one is actively making why the Book of Boba Fett ruined Star Wars videos far after its release, and no one's making why it's great videos either. So what's the legacy of the Book of Boba Fett? I think it's apathy. What I would highly encourage you guys to do is check out my Book of Boba Fett rewrite I did that I feel significantly improves the quality of the series. Also, let me know if you guys would like to see me do more rewrites. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.